So my name is Aeneas. The talk is titled "Code to Heart: Developing for the Open Source Community." And my goal for the session is that you take away some lessons from succeeding in open source, also how to build a business out of open source, and raising money for open source. I also got some notes on that. So this is really a story about how the company I co-founded, Ory, ended up securing 35,000 apps and hundreds of millions of users. We also recently raised our Series A, and Ory is now valued at $100 million, which is pretty unique for an open source company out of Germany. But before we start, I think it makes sense to give you something tangible, like what is Ory actually doing? And I think the best way to show it is by doing an example. In this case, I chose Deutsche Bank, which is maybe not the most exciting company, but it's something that people probably know. So when you're at Deutsche Bank and you want to sign up for a Deutsche Bank account, you have different options. One of those is called login with, okay, I have to do this again, login with VeryMe. And basically VeryMe is like an identity provider in Germany, and you can use it to log in into Lufthansa and other companies. So here, we have like a login screen. I can type in some details, which obviously won't work because that's not a valid account. It shows me that the account doesn't exist. I also have options to, for example, reset my password, or of course, sign up for an account at VeryMe. With some like validation forms and checking if your email exists, if your password has the right policies, and so on. So what Ory is doing is it actually powers VeryMe. So everything that you just saw, behind the scenes, we have APIs, sort of like a database that provides this functionality. So what VeryMe is doing is they're building a UI on top of our APIs to provide these capabilities around login, registration, account recovery, and so on and so forth. So you might ask, why does it matter? And like, how did we end up here? So the way we ended up here is I started like with developing games at 15, and had like a small community. And it was the first topic I had to solve was login, because I wanted people to be able to log in, to exchange like ideas around the games. And that was the first time I was exposed to actually the topic of like login and registration and all of these things. The second time I had to solve login, authentication, permissions was when I worked for Cello, and I co-founded Cello. Cello is like an open knowledge platform, which is a nonprofit organization in Germany. It's actually one of the largest learning platforms in Germany and maybe even in Europe. And there, basically, what people can do is, like, students can sign in and they can edit content similar to Wikipedia. They can do exercises, like doing math exercises. And for that, of course, again, they have to log in. So at Cerlo, we built login and all of these topics 2 times. So again, I was exposed to this area. And this is also a little bit where the whole open source approach that Ory is taking is coming from. So Cerlo is a nonprofit that has subscribed itself to open knowledge, and all the software we developed was actually in the open source. And we even received the Federal Cross of Merit from the German president for the work that we've done there. So when you think about these areas, it's probably like every website has a login. Like, what's difficult about that? And it was actually one of the fallacies that I had in the beginning. It's like, oh, okay, it's easy. I just need an email and a password, and then I sign in, and it's all good. And that's how most companies, and maybe the startup you're working at, is starting out. But at one point, it gets pretty complex because you have login with Google, for example, and then you need to send emails for people to recover their account. And then maybe you have like, need to send an SMS code to a phone to do a 2-step verification of the login, and just becomes very complex. And what we see is that companies start out with maybe 1 or 2 developers who work on this topic. And then in the end, it becomes a team of maybe 5 or 10 people within the company, even though maybe your business is, open knowledge, or it might be banking, such as with Deutsche Bank. So when I worked on these topics and I saw the way that open source works and people interact with the open source, one of the next software pieces I worked on was Ory Hydra, which is actually Ory's first product that was published in the open source. And this is really now going into more hey, these are my experience with open source. So when it comes to succeeding in building popular open source projects, I think there are few important takeaways. And for me, the first one was when we worked at Zerlo, the software was open source behind the scenes. It was like a content management system. But the problem was it was only targeted for Zerlo. Like we built it only for Zerlo, which means that no one else could really use it. So people enjoyed that it was in fact open source, but they couldn't really use it. When I worked on a second thing, which was Hydra, Ory Hydra, it was more that people could actually take the software, implement it in their own stack, use it, and then maybe change it a little bit and make it work for them. So one of the important takeaways for me in open source is it's really important to find a topic and to find a piece of software or problem that you can generalize and make available so that other people can actually use it. And it's not just open source for ideology or for the sake of open source. And I think this is really also a question. For example, there's consumer products which are open source, developed in the open source. I think that's great. But the projects themselves, like the open source projects, usually don't get a lot of traction because consumers don't care if it's open source or not. Maybe some do, but 99% don't. So if you work on open source, it often makes sense to target a developer audience because that's the ones, or those are the ones who will, make contributions, hack the software, add stuff to it, and so on and so forth. So I think one of the most challenging things in the first, getting a little bit of traction is how you get there. So of course, build something that maybe targets developers because they really love open source that will give you a little bit of traction. And that what I found always useful was to publish the work that I did on forums like Reddit, find specific subcategories, like for example, for JavaScript or for Golang, publish it there, see how people react. Is it positive feedback? Does no one care? That's also like an indicator. Or do people care? Do they have suggestions? And that's where you start to build your audience. And then it's always good to, write some blog articles and have good documentation so that people can get started quickly and easily with your open source project. And once you have a little bit of traction, there's a few things which are really important in my opinion. One of them is automation. So automation means that when, for example, someone's making a change to your open source project, you want that that change is verified and analyzed using automated tools. You don't want to be doing this yourself, right? So every time there's like a PR coming in or a change, you want that something is verifying that all of the stuff that the person did is correct. You don't want to be redoing it all manually. So automation is really important on a programming level. But automation is also important when it comes to explaining what the software is doing. So it's really important to have good documentation. My target is if I think that I'll spend maybe 2 or 3 days on writing documentation, that will in the end probably save me maybe hundreds of hours answering questions on GitHub or in Slack for people that don't really understand how to use the product because it's not explained. And then, of course, last but not least, there's a big topic around burnout amongst people who develop open source and maintainers. So there's, for example, a lot of libraries that have been abandoned by the people who originally wrote them because they feel overburdened with the amount of work that is coming in. And this can be from positive feedback, this can come from negative feedback, but often the problem is that very few people are working on an open source project. And at some point, after 5 years, it's maybe just enough. And honestly, I felt myself also overburdened with the open source work. And there's a few things how to ensure that you don't burn out. One of them is, just really taking a break, turning off notifications maybe for a week or two, maybe not seeing the task list that you have in the open source as, oh, this is all the to-dos that you have to do every day. And last but not least, it's really also how you turn open source into a commercial business to pay for all the bills, maybe to also add new people to the team so that you have just more help in the maintainership of the open source project. But maintainership is, and making profit out of open source is very difficult. And there's many companies who have failed at this. There's a few companies who have succeeded at this. And unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes left. Otherwise, I could have like a 3-hour talk about this, how to commercialize open source. But I just want to run through the top or the 3 major approaches to how making profit from open source works. So one is the so-called subscription model. This means that you have an open source project and then you sell a subscription with support, meaning that, for example, a company subscribing, they're paying you maybe 5,000 euros a year, and then they have some type of support. Maybe they can call someone, maybe they have like an email that they can write to, and then every time they have a problem with the open source, maybe it crashes or it's like too slow, they reach out to you and they ask, hey, can you help me? This is the model that Red Hat, for example, is pursuing. And it's an okay model, but it's not really scalable, because every time you have a new subscriber to your subscription, to your support, it means that you also have, maybe 1 or 2 people that need to be available for the support. So maybe you have like 10 subscriptions and you have 5 people, and then you have 100 subscriptions and you have maybe 60 people, because you need to add more people for support. You need to add people who manage the support. You need a whole corporate structure in place, HR and everything. So it becomes very bloated, and you are actually a little bit like an agency, like Accenture. And that isn't really a scalable model for software. And that's why most companies today don't really use this licensing, the support licensing anymore. The second option is to do a dual licensing, meaning that you have something in the open source, and then you have another project which is using parts of the open source, but they're closed source. So you have like features which you call maybe enterprise, and they are not available in the open source. This was pretty popular back in like 2013 to 2017. This also works, but it has a couple of caveats. For example, it's pretty difficult to judge like what should be an enterprise, but what should be paid for and what shouldn't be paid for. Where do you make the distinction? Do you take out things of the open source and put them into the commercial products and remove them from there? What happens if people want to contribute something that to the open source that is maybe a feature you had planned for the enterprise? Do you reject that contribution? So it becomes very difficult to decide, what to do in the open source community. And it's a very difficult, just co-living of the 2 pieces. So the third approach is the SaaS approach, meaning that you have something that's open source and you also run it as a service. This is a pretty popular model these days. For example, Pulumi, which is an operations tool, or HashiCorp Terraform, which is also an operational tool. They've all gone down this road. Other examples are, MongoDB and Cockroach Cloud, and of course, Ory. We've also chosen this path. So why is it like more scalable? Because you scale with your customers. So if you offer it as a service, it means that people consume it, and maybe they use, for example, like 1 gigabyte of storage with Dropbox, right? And then they pay, $10, and maybe they have more consumption because they have more users and more traffic. And then you have 100 gigabytes of storage reserved. That means that they pay maybe $1,000. So you scale with your customers, and you scale in a way that is works with the so-called economies of scale. Meaning, if you buy 1 disk, it's maybe more expensive than if you buy 100 disks, because it becomes more more affordable for you, and that means you make more profit out of it. So what does that actually look like? And let me just go here for Ory. So at Ory, we have basically the open source, and then we've put that open source into a SaaS and managed solution. And we have like some UIs here. We give you statistics and analytics about the usage of how do people interact with your platform. We have things like configuring two-factor authentication and enabling that, and other like things that you need when you are working with login and registration and these types of topics. And it's really convenient because I don't have to take the open source, run it, figure out how it works, and do like all of this stuff and hack it. I just sign up, I pay a little bit of money, and then it just works for me. Right. And that almost brings us to the conclusion, which is the last part, notes on raising money. So raising money for open source used to be extremely hard, actually impossible. The landscape is much friendlier today than it was maybe 10 years ago. And we have really talked to all like top line investors like Excel and Andreessen Horowitz and Sequoia. And for me, I think the most important part is that you have one person in the team, in the founders team, who is responsible for all investor relations and investor communications. Because sometimes investors, they, try to find an angle maybe with other team members. Hey, Aeneas, how do you see this? And then they go to another person. Hey, how do you see this? So it's important that you have one line and one story and one communication channel with all of these investors, because that helps get have the story straight. It helps to drive your interests that you have, not necessarily the ones that the investors have. And it really helps with fundraising, in my experience. Another important part is being able to say no. I know this is difficult because sometimes, maybe, yes, you finally got the first investor on the line and it's like all exciting and you don't want to say no, or maybe you're running out of money and it's like really urgent, you need to raise some funds right now, or you have another crisis and it becomes really difficult. But it's important to be able to say no, which is also why it's very important to start raising money early when you still have runway, when you have, let's say for Series C, maybe 9 months or 10 months of runway. For Series A, 9 to 12 months of runway, because that allows you, when negotiations stall with one particular investor, to just say, okay, look, we're done. Thank you for all the help. But we have someone else that we can talk to, and then just continue the conversation with them. And the last part is, don't be afraid to spend money on lawyers. I know it sounds a little bit ridiculous, but the money you spend upfront to have good lawyers who help you to negotiate deals, to figure out, what are all the intricate details of the contract that you're signing. It will be much cheaper if you spend a little bit of money upfront with them to structure the deal than it will be when you have signed a bad deal. So unfortunately, we're almost out of time, which is also then the conclusion of my talk. I think we still have a few minutes for a little bit of a Q&A. I know I rushed through the different slides, but maybe you have some questions about raising money or structuring open source projects, or maybe also adding login to your startup and to your app. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. And also you can reach out to us on a website, which is www.ory.sh, or to me on GitHub, which is Aeneas, so my first name R. And then of course you can also always reach out to me via email. Thank you. Nice, thank you, Michael. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. And otherwise we'll see each other on the stage in a couple of minutes.